My subject during the next hour is less Obadiah or either of the two texts that I have included than the subject of travel literature in general. And therefore, rather than arguing for distinguishing traits of the early modern period, though I don't doubt that there are some, I'm interested more in stressing the importance of travel literature as a way of getting at those traits. Both travel literature written by Jews and travel literature written by non-Jews. The passages I've included were written by Jews, but I'd like to open with a little piece touching on some non-Jewish travel writing of the 17th and 18th centuries. So I thought I would begin with some early modern travelers, begin with the outside perspective, European Christians writing about Jews, and then Jews writing about each other. Henry Blount, an Oxford graduate who traveled through the Levant during the 1630s, later reflected in his popular account of that voyage on why the Jews could never cement into a temporal government of their own. Among the reasons that he gave was that the Jewish complexion, and complexion in the 17th century doesn't mean what it means today. The complexion means more like character. The Jewish complexion is so prodigiously timid as cannot be capable of arms. For this reason, they are nowhere made soldiers nor slaves. 4 decades later, another Oxford graduate, Lancelot Addison, who had served as chaplain to the British garrison in Tangier between 1662 and 1670, wrote similarly of his experience among the Jews of Morocco. Even when bullied by the Moors, he reported, they dare not move a finger or wag a tongue in their own defense and vindication. Addison stressed, however, that the stoical patience with which they faced all injuries and insults cannot be imputed to any heroic temper in this people, but rather to their customary suffering, being born and educated in this kind of slavery. By reason whereof, he continued, they were never acquainted with the sentiments of an ingenuous and manly usage. In other words, Jews are not real men. Addison also commented on the Jewish aversion to all matters military, saying that the Moor permit not the Jews the possession, and this is why I was raising it this morning, the Jews permit not the Jews the possession of any warlike weapons, and herein they do not so much restrain as gratify their disposition. In other words, the Jews, he claims, were not interested in having weapons, for they seem generally inclined to a great averseness to everything that is military, being as destitute of true courage as good nature. And I just want to carry this into the 19th century. The lack of courage that allegedly characterized the Jews, and of course I'm speaking here about a construction and not using these travelers to tell us that the Jews were indeed lacking in courage just because the 17th century traveler to Morocco said so. Right? The lack of courage that allegedly characterized the Jews was sometimes seen on their faces by discerning Christians, and this whole science of physiognomy is a very central part of travel writing, because people go around the world looking at people's faces and finding there what they expect to find. During the early 1820s, the Anglican missionary William Jowett, not the later Jowett of Balliol, visited Jerusalem, where he met a certain Rabbi Mendel, who was highly respected on account of his Talmudical learning. Jowett, a graduate of Cambridge, was quite certain that he could read the rabbi's face like a book. And this is what he wrote. In addition to a certain wild, abstracted gaze, which you'll see around you at the table, which nature and Talmudical studies have given to the countenance of Rabbi Mendel, he was further suffering from terror, the impression of which was not yet effaced from his mind. He, having been about a week before forcibly seized in the night and carried off to prison by order of the new Ottoman governor. And I won't go into the entire story about the terror from which this Rabbi Mendel was suffering, but then he goes on to say, Jowett then piously added, how truly is that threat accomplished which the Sabbath after next we will read in the synagogues. Thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shall have none assurance of thy life, Deuteronomy 28:66. And in fact, this is what I meant earlier before when I talked about the difference between theological constructions and racialist ones, because in the Middle Ages there was indeed a theological notion of Jewish fear and timidity, which was seen as a curse upon the Jews as a result of their having engaged in excessive violence against that famous JC, Jesus Christ. Since they had engaged in too much violence, God cursed them and made them incapable of violence. This was the theological notion. As we get into the early modern period, there is a more racializing discourse, namely that there's something about the Jewish complexion or character or whatever, but then when you get to people like Jowett, who is a clergyman, you get a kind of combination of the two, namely someone who's using, on the one hand, the science of physiognomy to look at their faces and see in the violence and the terror and the madness that comes from Talmudic study. The wild abstracted gaze, which comes from Talmudic study, but also the biblical curse, which also continues to hang over the Jewish people. And here I would therefore add, going back to something that came up this morning in the discussion with Lois, that I think that when people like Manasseh ben Israel are speaking about the Jews as being having a natural instinct for business in the 17th century, this is in some ways a kind of a natural instinct which they received from God. So in some ways it is still that theological language of why are Jews good at business? They're good at business because they were blessed by God with this. That is his claim, in the same way that Christians around the same time are claiming why are Jews bad at war and good at business. This is in the early discourse, this is theological, later discourse racialist. But as I said, one can argue or disagree with what I said. I'm just trying to suggest that travel literature is one way of getting at these subjects. When people from one part of the world are encountering Jews in another part of the world, there's always the dynamic of, oh yes, I know what Jews are like, and they assume that because they see that in their faces or whatever, but then sometimes they deal with Jews, as I've written in my article about another English traveler who ended up in Venice. Sometimes they deal with Jews and they find out that they can be violent, or deal with Jews and they, work the land and not only engage in business, and then there are all sorts of reevaluations. So, this is just something I'm touching on, which is not officially part of my presentation, but as I want to stress that travel literature is a very important subject, not so much in the very positivist sense of, yes, we look at travel narratives, and when they tell us how many Jews there are in a certain place, then we can either debate whether they mean Jews or Jewish families, but not so much in terms of counting and facts, but also in terms of mental constructs. What are Jews like, and what does the experience of travel do? And then, using that as a segue, what does the experience of travel do? Let me move on to the Bertinoro material. I know that's Bertinoro, but when I speak English, I tend to say Bertinoro. And one of the things that interests me, both in this account, that is, say, the Bertinoro, and also probably in the Romanelli to a similar degree, although I'm leaving the Romanelli for last, is what I would call the sense of strangeness. Here, as I said, I'm focusing more on Jewish travel writing, though not exclusively that. And what I mean to say is that sometimes, one will forgive me for this, I hope I'll be forgiven for this paradox, but I think it makes sense. Sometimes this subjectivity has an objective edge to it. That is to say, we need to get into the mind of the traveler and see when he subjectively feels that he has crossed the border, when he feels he's no longer in a familiar territory, and that subjective experience on his part is important for us as kind of mental information. As he has passed a certain line and he knows that he is somewhere else. All of us have come to Middletown from other places, and at some point we've had, along the way, we've said, yes, we have passed place X and we're getting closer to New England or to Connecticut or to whatever it might be. So that's something that interests me very much, that is to say, what ways do writers use to express this sense of strangeness? Sometimes they say it in very clear ways, and sometimes, and now I guess I will skip ahead to the Romanelli for a moment, where Romanelli says something in the 18th century that his predecessor Montaigne said in the 16th, namely this is on page 23 of the Romanelli section. Just as the practices of the North Africans seem strange to our eyes, so our practices seem strange to theirs. That is to say, the way in which the experience of travel, Montaigne didn't do this through travel, but just through reading, but nonetheless, experience of travel can mix things up and let you realize not only are other people strange to you, but you can even appear strange. Things that are standard in your culture can appear strange to other cultures.
Yes. It makes me think of the Moroccan saying, and we appeared as crickets.
Right. In fact, right. Well, it's interesting. Right.
In our own eyes.
Well, it's interesting.
And we look that way to them as well.
Right. In fact, I recall distinctly that my sixth grade teacher said to me, "How do we know that those Jewish spies were liars? Because they said, and so we appeared in their eyes. And how did they know how they appeared in their eyes?" But I think in the case of Romanelli, when he says, "So our practice seems strange to theirs," I think that he is consciously projecting. That is to say, I think he means so our practice must seem strange to them, because he is not giving, he is not recounting an experience where he did something that was standard in Italy and that it appeared strange to others, but rather just in this sort of sense of, this is actually his reflections upon seeing a belly dance. So he's thinking about, oh, how weird this is to me, but yet then goes a step further and says things that we do must seem strange to them. Perhaps also, I guess, since we're already in that passage, one place where he seems to suggest that, I think, would be when he discusses the internal architecture. This would be on page 25. And he talks about the fact here he's in a Jewish home. In the bottom paragraph, they sit on the floor like Arabs, which doesn't surprise him very much, but it's just a metaphor. And then he says, "Under no account will you see the image of a female nude," I guess like we have here, the likeness of a male organ. Did you plan this for us, or it was just, or figures with bare buttocks or any other human nudity? There too, he's giving expression of the fact that if you were in a home, actually this is something that methodologically is important. Namely, how do we know what Italian Jewish homes looked like in the 18th century? To some degree, when an Italian traveler is in North Africa and he goes, here you will never see female nudes or any form of nudity inside decorating a home, you can then imagine that had he seen this in Mantua or anywhere in northern Italy among the Jews, it would not seem strange, but he's aware of the fact that a local Jew from North Africa who would visit the home of an Italian Jew and see images such as these might be rather shocked. So there is something in the experience of travel, which, as I said, sometimes the ways in which sometimes their comments about the culture they're encountering can fill in lacunae for us with regard to what they experienced at home. Just to give one example in a slightly different subject, but I guess relating to part of the world now in the press, namely Gaza. In the 15th century, a German priest traveled to the Holy Land, and also when he was in Gaza, visited the baths and commented how strange it was that men and women were separate and not together in the way that he in the way that he experienced it in Europe. That is to say, here he is going to a bathhouse where there are separate rooms for men and women, and this seems strange to him because in Europe it had been rather different. So all sorts of ways in which just the something which seems completely normal to us, the strangeness of that experience again reflects back on what had been left behind. Yeah.
Before you move on, could you comment on your reading of a few lines preceding what you just called for our attention? Page 25.
25 of Romanelli.
Yeah, the no breaking image may be seen on the walls.
Mm-hmm.
Because I would almost think when you say that, now I'm getting the two texts mixed up, I'm sorry, it's late in saying. But when you said an awareness that, gee, what I'm seeing here is strange. They came to my house in my country, they think our customs are strange. I don't know if you're suggesting any kind of, mutuality or tolerance or how can you describe that further? But I find these two lines quite interesting. His comment on their explanation for why there's no graven image, and then his own judgment. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, first of all, I must say that in terms of my own preparation for today, I didn't go back to the Hebrew so that whatever I'm reading here is based on the translation.
So they say it's because they don't have false God. They don't want to turn to false God.
Right. You're right. I think that, right. This simply reflects something that's quite commonly the case. Here, actually, he's the Maskil. This would be part of Romanelli, the Maskil, which would be a rather different subject, namely the ways in which he finds them to be simple-minded in their thinking and what I would call basically fundamentalist, and that they're parts of his travel account which have less to do with Italy, with Europe versus North Africa than they have to do with the Jewish Maskil in the 18th century going around dealing with more fundamentalist Jews and their assumptions.
Yeah, I think, though, Elliott, I'm not sure if this is the right point to raise this. Are you going to go on now to Bertinoro?
Yes.
All right, I'll let you.
Okay. So one thing I'd like to do in case of Bertinoro is, first of all, reorient us with regard to the what I would call the status of the text. That is to say that it's known to most of us, and the way that I also encountered it, as part of the library of pilgrimage literature to the land of Israel. And it is true that he ended up in the land of Israel, and it is true that he wrote from there. But I think that it's important to reevaluate this and possibly other land of Israel-related texts in terms of the original intentions of the author. This is a letter he writes from Jerusalem to his father, who has remained in Italy, and I guess I should make it clear now and for always that his name is Bertinoro in the same way that my name is Horowitz. I was not born in Horowitz, and he was not born in Bertinoro, but he was born in Città di Castello. At least that's where he lived his life until he left Città di Castello in Umbria, until he left his home. And I was just about to say until he left for the land of Israel, but I think it's not at all clear. If we look at the English, since I am denied the happiness of being able to serve you as I ought, for God has decreed our separation. Well, even that, if God has decreed our separation, that doesn't necessarily indicate, and this is the English, we'll see in the Hebrew is even sharper, doesn't necessarily indicate that when he left home, his plan was to migrate to the land of Israel, or even necessarily to go on a pilgrimage, but rather that something happened that forced him to leave. And I think that if we look at the Hebrew, this is page 37 of the Hebrew text, it's even sharper there. Acharei gazar Hashem b'freida ufaniti el asher faniti, which I would translate as, after God decreed my separation, and I turned to where I turned. That is to say that I think it's important to reevaluate this text and perhaps others and to see it as a Jewish banker, my esteemed colleague Ariel Toaf, has shown in the that in the archives of Città di Castello, not only does Obadiah appear among the bankers, but he appears first among the bankers. Either he was the most prominent banker, or because he was both the rabbi and the banker, he's at the top. In any case, he was functioning as a banker in Bertinoro and had to leave. You're right. Had to leave Città di Castello. Oh, sorry about the Bertinoro. As I said, but I'm going to keep making the Bertinoro mistake, and also that he left for the land of Israel. But because I haven't convinced myself yet. But because for many years I taught that, and then only last year did I begin rethinking of it. But I think that one way of looking at this text is a banker who runs into trouble for some reason or another, either Halshana, or that is to say, either he really did something wrong in banking, or it was reported, or a very simple possibility in the world of banking, namely that someone who owed him money didn't come through, and therefore he was stuck with his creditors. That is to say, we need not see this as a terribly embarrassing situation, but just one that nonetheless would make it better not to be in Città di Castello than to be in Città di Castello, and he left suddenly. I think that if we then continue reading the text, yes.
Second, why do you translate it as my separation? The Freda is a general,
right.
Like it's my fate.
Okay.
It's a very general statement. It says it's God. I mean, it's not anybody's fault, but this is the higher powers decision.
Right.
This is my fate.
Let's even take that higher powers did not send him to the land of Israel, though. However we read it. Right.
But still, it's a very vague and...
Which I agree entirely that's very vague. I also would like to stress that however we read this text and similar texts literally, they are intentionally literary. That is to say, even when I put in the word my separation, you're right, God decreed separation. Of course, we know God did not decree separation. It's just some flowery way of saying, I had to get the hell out of there. Of course, he doesn't say the hell, right? I'm putting
this. It doesn't even mean I had to. Actually, it doesn't even mean...
Fine, but what I'm separating, though, the literary meaning for it. This is a letter to his father. He had been, as many of us know, Italian Jews were taught flowery writing in first grade, and consequently, and he's been writing letters to his father of this sort since he was 10 years old. So he's intentionally using a high style, and therefore I would separate, there's always a gap between the high style and the facts. But what is important is that there's no suggestion whatsoever that he had made up his mind to go to the land of Israel until far later in the text, namely after he's already in Naples. Although another esteemed colleague, Avraham David, has, as you can see, filled the pages with all sorts of references. The references he has not put in are those that can be put in. Maybe he left them for us. All you need is a concordance on your desk, and I think it is necessary to fill in all the various biblical allusions, something I have not yet done, but there's no doubt in my mind that there's a lot of intertextuality here. For example, a little bit further down the line, when he says, Kasher kiliti ma'asai be'eretz mchurotai. There too, I have a strong sense, I'm not sure exactly how, it's not Adler who translated it, but whoever it was. Yes, in my place of residence, Città di Castello is what we have in the English translation on T10. I think it suggests even a stronger sense of belonging. And by the way, this too is, I think, part of what we can look at in travel literature. And I don't mean the sense of belonging in the false dichotomy, just saying that for your benefit, false dichotomy of diaspora versus land of Israel, which in some ways is false in this period. But also in terms of sense of belonging to something larger than a village. For example, to what degree do Jews of the Veneto feel that they belong to the Veneto and not only to Venice, or to Lombardy and not only Lombardy, or Italy, or whatever it is? That is to say, the sense of belonging beyond your own community and town. And I think that there is a sense of belonging, and that he is going into exile when he leaves Città di Castello and goes south to Rome. Now, what is striking for anyone who has been to Rome, and certainly, and even for those who have not, the amazing thing about this account is that he writes it after being traveling all the way from Città di Castello to the land of Israel, and skips Rome as if there's nothing to report. There's absolutely nothing of interest. Having arranged all matters in my place of residence, Città Castello, I repaired to Rome, and then to Naples, where I arrived on the 12th of that month, and then to Salerno, and on, and then you'll see it's only at Palermo that he has something to report to his father. Now, there's no doubt that there were many things of interest in Rome and in Naples, and possibly even in Salerno. However, what he alludes to in the letter is that he promised to give his father information about the ways of the Jews in the various places. Yes, you see that above, where he said, "You wrote to me in Naples asking me to tell you about the manners and customs of the Jews in all the places I have visited." So my sense then, again, whether I'm correct or not, I'm just following the methodology of how to read a travel document, is that from this text alone it would suggest that in Rome and in Naples he saw nothing in Jewish life that would interest his father in Città di Castello.
That his father was never there, and either of those
it's we don't know it, but it's likely. Right.
It's likely it was or wasn't.
They wouldn't have been in Rome?
Yes.
I have no reason whatsoever to believe that an Italian banker, part of these network families of the 15th century, would not have been in various Jewish centers in central and south central Italy. It seems to me what his father wants to know is about the places he's never been. Okay. He's probably got a brother-in-law in Naples, and certainly he's got 3 cousins and 14 distant relatives there. I mean, that's the way these families work.
Okay, so in this particular case, I'm not interested in arguing as to whether Mr. Yare had been to Rome or not, but rather how striking the text is, and then one could take the Cooperman approach and say he obviously had been to Rome, and therefore there was no need.
This is the Marcus approach.
Okay, Marcus Cooperman approach, that he obviously had been to Rome and Naples, and there was nothing to report. Or the other, and as I said, for the purpose of this seminar, I have no stake in one argument or the other, only that it's very striking.
It's much simpler. He says, look at the Hebrew, he says, how do you know that he stayed there? Maybe he just crossed it.
Okay.
I don't know how you can. I mean, there are so many possibilities here.
Right.
So we shouldn't go into detail of this.
Well, no, because what interests me very much, what I want to stress and get back, just 1 second, Margaret, what I want to get back to, what I want to get back to in the sense of strangeness, is that only about Palermo does he have something to say. And what I'm therefore suggesting is that only in Palermo did he see a new world. What he saw until Palermo were either things that were fairly familiar to him. Now, again, this doesn't have to mean, and this is why I prefer not to enter into the question of whether he had been in Rome before or not been in Rome. That is to say, on the mental level, he when he traveled from Città di Castello through Umbria to Rome, then to Naples, he did not feel that he entered a new world. And when he arrived in Palermo, he was in a new world. His father doesn't really need to know, for example, that in Palermo there are coppersmiths and ironsmiths and porters and peasants, etc. And I don't think that his father, for example, had a detailed knowledge of the occupational structure of the Jews of Naples. So that it's not like my father knows everything about Naples and nothing about Palermo, and therefore I'll start to fill him in. I think here you have that combination of two categories. Therefore, he was so overcome with Palermo as being a new world for him that he began to describe everything, whereby, from the perspective of having already arrived in Jerusalem and writing back to his father, Rome and Naples, you know what they're like. So whether he'd been there, whether he heard about it, whether he got postcards, all of this doesn't matter so much as what I'm trying to stress is that from their shared perspective, Palermo was something new to write home about in the most literal sense, whereas Rome and Naples were not, at least from the Jewish point of view.
I'm wondering how these texts as early modernists. We have earlier the travel literature. Even the Romans, when they went up north to Europe, wrote, these Alemanni have these strange customs. So how do you, that's your discussion of the methodology of these travelers' accounts, make them early modern accounts?
Because from the 15th century on we have many more of them, and because my sense here, as opposed to earlier accounts, is that there's an interest in behavior, and not only, in other words, you have a kind of return to Herodotus if we're looking at older models, and I'm interested in using these accounts as ways of seeing how Jews made sense of different kinds of patterns of behavior in different parts of the Jewish world. That is to say, this relativizing experience whereby you grow up somewhere and you think this is the way to be Jewish, and then you travel through various communities and you see that there are a number of ways of being Jewish, and I mean being Jewish in the widest sense, that is, say, observance, Jewish culture, society, whatever. Just, for example, to skip forward, as I've argued elsewhere, and I'll provide the bibliographical details to anyone who wants, when he talks about the fact that the Jews of Palermo are strict in matters of wine, but lenient in matters of sexual relations with menstruant women, I argue that this is a metaphor for the difference between northern Italy and the south, where Jews were very lenient in matters of wine and very strict in the matter of avoiding relations with menstrual women. So that what he is looking at is not simply to give you a list. They do this, they don't do that, they are in this occupation or not, but rather I think that there is an attempt to describe a religious culture. And the attempt to describe a religious culture I find to be rather new.
Just a mythological point. It seems that there's so many factors at play when you're looking at this kind of literature. You might have had economic difficulties in one place, another place you just happen to have a chance to spend life. It seems to me difficult to glean from this kind of text and say, aha, Palermo, there's a difference. Maybe he was in better spirits than Palermo.
Well, I would say this. Then my argument is, and that's where I get back to what I said at the beginning, I'm not so interested, for the purpose of today's discussion, in this text as texts like this. So that I would, so what I would then look for in another travel account would be, where does the person move from sort of matter-of-fact description to this really interests you, and then to think about why that is happening. So that I think that in this particular instance, it's not simply that he all of a sudden starts to tell his father in great detail about Palermo, but the things he tells him about Palermo turn out to be exactly the reverse of what we know to be true in northern Italy. So it's not simply the verbosity that tells us that things in Italy must have been in northern Italy must have been quite different. But when we get to the exact details, for example, this notion of there's something that's left out in the English. I want to get to that in a moment, about what Adler has deleted and why it's the necessity for new translations is also the necessity for fuller translations. But he has an entire section, which I'll show you in the Hebrew, which is deleted by Adler from the original, page 38. In the Hebrew, lines 24 through 30, though they were translated in 1872 in the miscellany of Hebrew literature from which Adler drew, although they were translated euphemistically, but they were there, Adler decided to leave this out. And I think it's not simply because he had no room. He had plenty of room to tell us about the occupational structure of Jews of Palermo, somehow left out Obadiah's comments about the fact that the Jews were informers upon each other to the degree that informing was a way of life, and that they were in no way even apologetic about doing this. And then the great line where he says that in addition they are quite lenient in matters of menstrual prohibitions. Most engaged women arrive pregnant at the canopy of marriage, and however they are extremely strict in avoiding the wine of the Gentiles. And
how do you? This isn't the women are pretty, or they do this or they do that. This is a kind of a comment about the deep structure of the culture. How does he know that, and why do you take him seriously?
Why do I take him seriously? For one, because he spent long enough there even to have found time to speak in the synagogues about attempt to change their behavior, both in matters of informing and in matters of relations with menstruants. In fact, he says, you wouldn't know this from the English translation, so I should need to fill you in. He says on page 213, in my discourses I inveighed against informers and other transgressors. Other transgressors is the translation of Bo'alei Nida, of those who have sex with menstruants. Yes, but so just to finish the thought then, what I want to stress is that he sees the Jews of Palermo not as being less religious, to use an anachronistic term, less religious or less observant than the Jews of northern Italy, but rather for there to be different emphases, and things that are important there are relatively unimportant in the north, and vice versa. And I think this is the kind of what I would call religious anthropology that we do not know before the early modern period, at least. I don't know. I don't think Benjamin Tudela does this very much in his travel writing. Again, we can go back to Chrysostom, and I'm sure he has something too. There's no doubt that we can always find something in the Middle Ages, but I don't think, and I've spent it's true I didn't go to graduate school at Harvard, but I still spent a fair amount of time studying the Middle Ages. I don't think that we have extensive accounts of religious life that take a sympathetic interest in how they're different. Yes?
You just said that he gave Drashot that they shouldn't do it. I mean, it doesn't mean to be a relativism, though. It doesn't seem to be a relativistic approach. If what you said is right, he saw it, he thinks it's wrong, he gives Drashot against it, he's proud that he dissuades them from doing it. So that...
Well, obviously you think that rabbis are one-dimensional people. When I say obviously it's not so, but for example, Yossi, Hakir and I had an interesting discussion at lunch about the passage I mentioned earlier from Ibn Zimra, where Yossi drew to my word not stressed correctly that the same Ibn Zimra who makes fun of people who remove their tefillin before Musaf because they want to look like Kabbalists is himself a Kabbalist. That is to say that he's aware that they're both two dimensions. He himself is, on the one hand, an inherent this sect. On the other hand, he is aware of the complex sociology. And here I would say the same. Obadiah is a rabbi, a card-carrying rabbi, and if he's up there speaking, he will draw attention to, when he's speaking to the community, draw attention to their failures. On the other hand, when he is writing to his father and trying to present a thumbnail sketch of what life there is like, he then chooses two matters which, not by coincidence, are the opposite of Italian Jewry in the north, namely the strictness with regard to wine and the stringency with regard to menstruance. Just one last sentence in my answer to Adam, which is that later on when he's describing the Jews of Rhodes, he says, they observe the law against wine just as strictly as against pork. And I don't think that that's intended as a compliment. So that there is the internal sense of cultural relativism and how people have their how different Jewish cultures, let's say in this case the Eastern Palermo through the Eastern Mediterranean, has different emphases from Northern Italy, and I think in the end he retains a certain loyalty to the culture from which he comes, though he realizes that it has many foibles. Ken?
I think that there's certainly something to be said for the notion that this literature is pretty novel. You say compare it with Travail. He's interested. He's strictly interested in the communities and functions of the communities, as I off the top of my head. And here you're looking at it. The question is, how constructed is it? The question isn't why doesn't I would ask not so much why doesn't it report about Roman Naples? What's this nonsense going from Città to Castello to Napoli in 3 days? I don't know where I don't remember exactly where it is. I think
I was there.
On the other side of it's somewhere near Ancona.
It's near Arezzo.
Near Arezzo.
Yes, I went on pilgrimage.
Way up, okay?
I studied his commentary on the Mishnayot in Città di Castello.
It's fine. It's very important to visit these places because you get a sense of the distance. I don't remember how much Apennines he would have to cross at that point. But though we're talking about a distance there for so we're talking about a distance of over 400 kilometers. He made it in 1497, 3 days. He invented a new mode of travel. I mean, unless he was really expressing.
Okay.
So that, even Rome, Naples, there's a little bit of a shift. Okay. You have to climb up and stuff.
Okay, and therefore, let's say it was really twice that, and he lied. So what are the implications?
Serious. What I'm saying is that there may be a lot more here that's constructed than it's not that he's reporting what he saw one place or another because it's interested in him because of the difference. And what I'm asking is, do we have any way of looking at this material and saying to ourselves, the reportage is an accurate reportage, or that is in the sense that if you or I were to take this trip, we would say it took 3 hours and 22 minutes and the train broke down, or is he really emphasizing points? This is actually toward your thesis. Is he really emphasizing points that he wants to do? That he's moving, he's emphasizing. He says Now there's something that there's a problem in Corfu, I think, a bit later. There's something not because of one of the Jewish courting customs. It's in Finkelstein, in Jewish self-government. They put them in bed together like bundles.
No, there are two Mediterranean phenomena which I think are conflated here. One is frequency of premarital sex in the sense of engaged couples. That's one. But my argument, as I've made elsewhere, is that there is also a problem here with regard to the wider phenomenon of mikveh use by women, which I think women use bathhouses rather than mikvah, which bothers him. But nonetheless, what I'm stressing is that these subjects are mentioned somewhat in passing as ways of highlighting to his father how different the religious culture is. And that is the sort of thing that I'm interested in getting a hold of. That is, say, writers who are not only giving us facts, but trying to characterize a culture.
I understand that, but in other words, how do we sort out his material? How do we get some kind of criteria for judging what he's saying and saying this is really what was, or this is what he wanted to say?
Right. So I'm suggesting let's trust. This is what I said at the outset. Let's trust his subjectivity. That is, so he's writing to his father. When he sees Palermo as the first really different place, that means something. That's what I'm suggesting. It could be that there are other reasons, but that's the reading that I'm suggesting here. Let us follow the subjectivity of the traveler and see when they feel that they have crossed a mental divide. And I think this applies to the dozens of travel books and accounts that I've read, over the years. There's always a point at which a traveler feels they have passed into unfamiliar territory, and the writing changes a bit. And I think this is one of those instances.
I just want to say we were about the look at the text. It says in the 9th month, in Rosh Chodesh, he left Rosh Chodesh and he arrived on the 12th. Sorry, it took him 12 days. So
which is why I didn't want to, because it said one way or another, the issue is not here.
Whatever, this is a small.
It's not how many days.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Obadiah, you are okay.
Claudia? Yeah.
The first day of the 9th month, so
Okay, there it
That
is.
was something that Adam raised. I suggest that when I think Adam was alluding to this question, how does he know that the women that they are lenient in with regard to third? And I'd like to suggest, I know, and you just mentioned that we know that in certain areas of the Mediterranean, certainly there were different practices pertaining to mikvah and whether the water was drawn or not drawn to certain specifications, and that Romanelli Jews get criticized for this type of aberration from the Ashkenazi perspective. But I'd like to suggest that this is really much simpler, because if we're really talking about premarital sex, I'm wondering, and here the halachists in the room have to, tell me whether this is possible, insofar as a Jewish bride prior to her wedding goes to the mikvah for the first time in order that her husband not be a boa like Nida, in order that he, if a woman has not immersed herself in a ritual bath prior to her marriage, doesn't that automatically make a pregnant bride somebody who has violated the laws of menstrual purity? In other words, it's not two different offenses, it's the same offense, right? The Gam Isur Hanida Mehilim Ma'od Viro Ha'od.
Right, that is my reading. That is my right. Yes, that is my sense. But and that they will not do so after marriage either.
Well, that
is my right. Is my argument. That is, yes. No, I know that from elsewhere. Right.
That doesn't necessarily.
Right. I'm saying. Right. No, this is precisely. No. Precisely.
So, in other words, his objection becomes a technical objection to their using a bathhouse as being from ritual mikvah.
He doesn't say this.
I know.
Yes. But there is much external evidence for this to be true of the Eastern Mediterranean. So that there are two possible readings of Obadiah. One is that he's interested only in the matter of premarital sex, which I think is not the case. I'll explain why in a moment. And the other is that there's a much wider phenomenon. In this case, again, this is my argument that Palermo is part of the Eastern Mediterranean phenomenon, which other writers have observed upon that it's medieval halachis. In fact, one medieval halachis writes in the 13th or 14th century, somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, that a certain Jew arrived from elsewhere, a rabbi, and he had his wife go to a proper mikvah, and all the women yelled at her and beat her up or whatever because they were making her look bad. So it's quite clear that there was, in terms of the local culture, an alternative, and not for Karaite reasons, alternative purification in bathhouses of some sort or another, but not in a proper mikvah. He recognized that this was a problem, and he, for example, when he then says, I invade against informers and other transgressors, meaning Bo'alei Nida, I don't think that there he meant those young people who had sex before marriage, but I think he meant the community in general, which was not using a proper bathhouse, which in all cases they constructed and didn't use.
I just like to raise here, I don't want to keep you from doing another point that you're going on to. But it seems to me that you alluded to, but I think it could be developed further, the real the possibility of using travel literature. I mean, a lot of the studies, the recent studies of travel literature, become a very popular area of work. People talk about the mapping of identities and the creation of identities. And I think that in talking about Romanelli, that was sort of part of what you're saying. And when you talk about these people coming to Palermo and suddenly seeing something, he's generalizing, or he's seeing an identity because it's different. But he's not just seeing an identity because it is different. He is also generalizing, because that's what travel literature does. Travel literature, unlike biographical material, things like that, which tends to be very specific and talk about individual experiences, travel literature tends, as a general structure, to generalize from very often quite minimal contact. You take a trip, people go on voyages, and they're, today is Tuesday, I must be in Belgium, and they say, all Belgians are because they met one person, or they do it like that. So I think in looking at this material, and I think you sort of began to do it a little bit with Romanelli, I don't think it's enough to say, gee, difference must be what excited them, or where they come from, or that we can see difference in what they choose to comment on, but it's also the way in which they commented, and this I think is in a sense what Ken was asking. You want to know how they construct, or is there any way to get at the construction? Now, in particular with the Romanelli, those comments being written, as you said correctly, as a Maskil, they're tendentious as hell, and they actually lie about the nature of what most northern Italian Jewish families would have been like. It's certainly, I doubt highly that most northern Italian Jewish homes had figures of graven images on the wall.
Let me just interject and say, but if you look at down to both, you might rethink that.
Well, but now the problem becomes, first of all, is that a graven image, right? And
I'm referring not to the graven, but to the buttocks and other things.
He takes the trouble to say, I think it's because they're stupid. I think it's because they resent that. So he's playing a role here. So it's not just the difference that you want to comment on, and it's not just the generalization, it's also the agenda.
Yeah, here I would agree with you entirely, and I would say this, that in terms of the construction of the identity of the author, or the consciousness of the identity, I would say that Obadiah is writing as a northerner versus, when I say as opposed to the south, that is describing the south through the eyes of a northerner. Whereas Romanelli in the 18th century is describing North Africa as a European. I don't think that, in terms of what I said earlier about constructing identity geographically, I don't think that Obadiah, and of course it's hard to pin him down on this, I don't think he really has a sense of European. For example, and last point I'll make is with regard to Egypt, and I don't think that he has a very strong sense of European in Egypt in the same way that Romanelli feels to be a European in North Africa. So there I would say that is part of his being a Maskil, the Jew taking on the identity. In fact, this would be an interesting question to raise. Generally, when do European Jews begin to feel European, and in what ways? It is true that somewhere Cecil Roth has an essay called The European Period in Jewishness. Doesn't he have something? Or The Jew is European? Does anybody know? I think Cecil Roth, well, I could say, if Cecil Roth didn't write an essay called The Jew is European, he could have written an essay called Jew is European. But this sense of the Jew feeling himself as European, and not Ashkenazi, gets started, European, I think is true of Romanelli here. I don't think it's what we get with Obadiah in the 50s. That would be one kind of difference.
One last quick question that you want to comment before I hope you comment on it. Would it be possible to argue that Obadiah is already an indication of an early modern, I mean, this is pretty early for early modern, but let's say that he is early modern in the sense, if you're correct, that he's coming in here, he has a real sense of difference, that he feels it's important to write back about, or that his father asked him here about. Could we argue that this is already an early modern phenomenon, not just in the sense of identifying with your own local group, but the idea of travel as a source of observing the way things are done elsewhere? that is a particular form of early modern consciousness?
Well, I would say this, not so much travel as a form, but the ability to see yourself through the eyes of others, that is to say, the ability to do this reciprocal gaze, whereby you're engaging, as Montaigne did in the 16th century, a form of cultural relativism, namely, it's not that mine is the absolutely desirable way in the eyes of God, or theirs is, but there are different ways of working this thing out. We do it one way in the north, they do it another way here, and he's not exactly saying piously, Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim, but I think, again, in response to what I was saying before, I don't think he's, as they say in Casablanca, shocked by what he's seeing, but rather using these as a way of describing to his father the contours of a religious culture. And I think this sort of describing Jewish life in terms of competing or alternate Jewish cultures, rather than the hierarchical sense of we're close to God and they're further away, is, I think, for example, I don't know if you have this among, I guess the test case would be, can Rabbinites write about Karaites that way in the Middle Ages? If they can, that would be, but here I think this is where you see the difference, where you don't have that kind of discourse about Karaites.
Okay.
Yes,
just a short, you have to compare it to others, and other writers, even Shulam Voltaire, which is like in 1480, he has the same interest of description of other communities and comparing them to his own. And you have, in my opinion, this has nothing to do with early modern, although it is also in the early modern, but it has to do with a different kind of Jewish traveler who is not going to a holy place like a pilgrimage, but a Jewish merchant or a type of different traveler who even earlier, yes, to some degree, even Elijah of Bertinoro has it. Not
also 15th century, right?
The same century, but I mean, then you push the early modern period to 1440 or so.
No problem. Well, if we go to the history department, that's then when the early modern period begins.
Whatever, what I mean is, there is a kind of a different traveler which makes mainly the difference. He is much more open to look at other cultures and other Jewish kinds of society and mores and behaviors, and that's the major difference. So probably it's more prevalent in the early modern period, I assume so.
Yes, I have no problem considering most of the 15th century. I'm not fixated on the Spanish expulsion.
I think we can call it a day. Thank you very much indeed.